Welcome to another episode of What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing? And now we've had so many, we've had months and months of these, and it's just been a joy, just meeting the coolest, most interesting people, which we're going to do as well today. I'm Karen E. Osborne, author of Getting It Right and Tangled Lies, which comes out on July 22nd. And my guest today is Pamela Taylor. And she is quite the prolific writer, I must say. She has a series called the Second Son Chronicles. And there are 5 books in that series. Is that right, Pamela?
That's correct. Second Son Chronicles.
And yes, and five books in this series. And we're going to hear all about it. So welcome, welcome. I wanted to start by asking you, do you read a variety of genres, or do you tend to just read historical fiction?
Actually, I read a variety. It's probably easier to ask me what I don't read than what I do read. I can't go down the horror path. There's just something about that just does not work for me. I don't like being kept up wide awake for 5 nights in a row because it's something I just read in a book. But I thoroughly enjoy historical fiction. I like espionage novels. I like mysteries. I like suspense thrillers. I've even read some high fantasy recently that I've thoroughly enjoyed. So I'm kind of all over the map.
Cool. Well, what books would you, among all those choices, is there a book that you would like to recommend to our audience?
Oh gosh, I've been reading so much lately. I have you can call it my day job if you want, but I do freelance editing. So I've read a lot of books recently that aren't published yet that will be coming out later this summer. And I can tell you, your listeners are in for some real treats. I know yours is coming out in July. Congratulations, by the way. And there's some real treats coming out this summer. So no spoilers, but they're across multiple genres: some women's fiction, some historical fiction, some fantasy. A lot of things to look forward to.
Well, that sounds good. So is there a book that you've read that is already published that you could recommend to our audience?
Oh gosh, I feel like if I did that, I would be choosing one of my clients over the other, and I would really prefer not to do that.
Yeah.
But for something that's already been published, something I read fairly recently, um, Karen Brooks is an Australian author, and she's written a series of historical fiction novels set in various time periods. I just recently finished the one called The Chocolate Maker's Wife. And she does a phenomenal job of introducing you to uh, a culture that was happening in Restoration England. We know about the coffee house culture, but what I didn't know about until I read her book and did some research on it was about the chocolate house culture.
Hmm.
The explorers had only recently begun to bring chocolate from the New World, and uh, it was used mostly in those early days as a drink. And so there sprang up these chocolate houses, very similar to a coffee house. And that's where a lot of the um, social activity, certainly for the men of the day, was, and where they went to read political pamphlets and discuss philosophy and political ideas. And she's built a fascinating book around it. It's called The Chocolate Maker's Wife.
Nice, very nice. Well, thank you. That's another good book for me to think about as my list.
Oh my gosh, my TBR pile is huge.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There's not enough time in the day to read all the wonderful books, but we keep trying. We keep trying. So we've had the pleasure on this show, on this podcast, to have quite a few fantasy writers. And you write historical fiction, which we want to hear all about. We want to hear about the Second Son Chronicles. But before you actually talk about your books themselves, is there a relationship, like for fantasy writers, they have to do all this world building? Does a historical author have to do similar things in terms of world building?
We do indeed, but we have the advantage of the world is already there for us. What we have to do is understand it and set it up for the readers, help them understand what was going on in the world at the time of our story. The fantasy writers actually have a bigger job because they have to build this from whole cloth entirely in their imaginations. We have the ability to tap into the historical record and understand what was happening at the time, but we have no less responsibility to shape that world for our readers because unless we're talking about fairly recent history, there's a high degree of likelihood that the reader is not going to be familiar with the precise period of time in which we've set our narratives.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I'm sure that the more we can bring that time alive, the more satisfying both the writing and the reading it must be.
Well, I certainly agree with you there, both from both perspectives, because I do read a fair amount of historical fiction. And um, one of the things that I've tried to bring into my writing is what I've learned from other really gifted authors in the field about how they do that world building and how they actually immerse you in a time and place that you might never have thought about considering going.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I just maybe a couple of weeks ago, I had as a guest a historical writer, Stacia Pelletier, and I remember reading her first book, The Accidents of Providence, and just being immersed in the time period. And it's a gift. It's a gift. So let's talk about your gift. So you tell us a little bit about your writing journey and what brought you to the point of writing this amazing series. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
It's probably not all that different from a lot of novelists in that at some point we decided to sit down and figure out, can I do this? I
Mhm.
had, during my career in the software industry, I wrote a lot of technical material. And I also wrote a lot of marketing material. And particularly in the marketing material, a lot of it is about storytelling because you're telling a story about this product that you have that you're trying to get people interested in. So when I sat down to think about, well, can I actually write fiction? The first couple of efforts sort of fizzled out at some point. I got to a point where, yeah, I don't know where this is going. I don't know what to do with this. And somehow, when the idea for the Chronicles came to me, something clicked. I don't know why. The first draft of the first book was certainly not the final one that was published. I still had a lot of learning to do as a fiction writer. And in fact, one of the things that has been the most insightful to me as I've been on this journey is that we talk about ourselves as being storytellers. And yet, what we really are is we're story revealers. We have to pull people into these characters and we have to make them love or hate the characters. And we have to show the lives of the characters and what's going on in these events around them. And so as I think back about my first two attempts that got shelved, My biggest problem at that point in time was that I was telling the story, and all I had really written was a particularly long synopsis. So now that I have a better feel for what the process of bringing a novel to life is, I actually am considering going back to those first couple of ideas. There may be something there may be not, but I'm toying with the idea of dragging them out again and seeing if there's anything to work with.
You know, that's so interesting that you say that. I too wrote and realized that I didn't know what I was doing, but it was just in me. And I've just gone back to one of my shelved stories and just reimagining it and rethinking it because I love the characters so much. So I totally understand. I think you should go back to those shelf stories, but there's a lot of good things there. So go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say thanks for the encouragement. I'm really pleased to hear it's working for you.
Thanks. So tell us about the Second Son Chronicles. What is the series about?
Well, it's set in the early to middle 14th century. And it's told in the first person from the point of view of the protagonist, whose name is Alfred. Um, it it begins, and in fact, it was the first paragraph of the first book that was one of these sort of things that came to me in the middle of the night. And it just was sort of the germ of the idea that created the first book. Alfred is the second son of a second son in the royal family. And so he is pretty far away from what you think of as the direct line of succession.
Mhm.
But his grandfather, who is currently the king, is convinced Alfred has some sort of special destiny. The grandfather really doesn't know what that destiny is going to be, but he's absolutely convinced that Alfred was born for something special. And the Chronicles follow that journey of Alfred's discovery of what his life really turns out to be and whether or not his grandfather's vision is in fact something that plays out as he lives his life.
Wow. So this new one, The Shadow, how old is he? How old is Alfred? How much of his life has been lived by the time this new one that just recently came out, right? It just
Right. He has, let's see, the first four books getting up to Shadows probably cover a period of about 12 to 15 years.
Mm.
So he is roughly in his early 30s at the time of Shadows. I had originally planned for it to be a 4-volume series. And I had story arcs for each individual book, and I had the overall overarching story arc for the 4-book series. And as I was starting to wind down the work on volume 4, I'm thinking, there really are threads here that I haven't tugged on yet. There are a couple of branches of Alfred's family tree that I haven't really explored.
Mm.
And he's got more story to tell. He just wasn't ready to stop talking to me. So the series grew from there, and it looks now like it's going to wrap up with volume 7.
That's wonderful. You know, it is so interesting, isn't it, as novelists, that these characters are so alive and they have a mind of their own sometimes. They have
Oh,
they have they lead us sometimes rather than us leading them, which I love that part of writing.
it really is amazing. Before I really became a fiction writer, I would listen to interviews on talk shows, on radio, and elsewhere. And they would be interviewing someone and they would say, well, the characters told me this, or my characters led me this direction. And I kind of poo-pooed it. And now they have lives of their own. And basically I'm just their mouthpiece to tell their story, as it were. I have this one character who doesn't show up until volume 6. And I gave him a name and I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, in the previous version, I had given a different character a very similar name. I had a Hugh and a Hugo. And I'm like, I can't do that. Readers are going to be completely confused by these two very similar names. So I thought, well, I'll just rename the most recent character. And he was having none of it. He was going to be Hugo. That's all there was to it. I had to go back and change the other character's name. And fortunately, the book hadn't been published yet, so it was okay.
I love that story, Pamela. That is awesome. And it's true, we don't want to have people with similar names because it confuses readers, but our characters sometimes know exactly who they are. They know who
They do.
they do. They know who they are. I have one other question about shadows. So now this is the 5th book in the series, and he's in his 30s. And can you just give us a hint of what kind of conflict or, what he's facing? Just give our audience just a taste of what's going on in Shadows.
Absolutely. I mentioned that there were branches of the family tree I hadn't explored. Well, one of those branches is Alfred's aunt. And she apparently had been quite a troublemaker in her youth, to the point where her father banished her from the kingdom. And she decides to put in an appearance. It's when she first makes her request of, can I come home? Alfred thinks it's a kind of innocuous request. She's family. Why can't she come home? Well, then he starts to learn what a troublemaker she had been. And he's faced with the dilemma of what is he going to do about her? And when she shows up uninvited, the dilemma is very real and very much in front of him in the moment. And he has to solve that problem. And his solution to that problem, as you might imagine, is not necessarily the end of the story.
Yes.
Being the troublemaker that she is.
Indeed, indeed. So if our audience wanted to learn more about the Chronicles and know more about you and be in touch with you, what are the best ways? Where can we find you on social media?
Well, there's certainly on my website, which is pamela-taylor.com. There is a contact form, and there's more about me and about my writing. If you want to follow me on Twitter or Instagram, I'm at PJT Author, all one word. And I really invite my fans to follow the Chronicles on Facebook at the page that I've created for the Chronicles. It's the Second Son Chronicles on Facebook. You'll find a post there about the Chronicles. You'll find information about upcoming releases. I also have a feature that I do using the notion of Throwback Thursday, where I put on my Facebook page and then in a gallery page on the Chronicles website photos that I've taken during my research that are related to the world of the 14th century and that might feature in, uh, for instance, if you were trying to imagine a movie of Alfred's world, would you have images like this in there? So to try to trigger people's imagination about what the world of Alfred's life was like. Um, on my website, pamela-taylor.com, you can subscribe to my newsletter. And one of the promises I make to my newsletter subscribers is that I will not fill your inbox full of spam. You'll only get a newsletter when there's something of interest. I announce new releases there to my subscribers first before I make it public on any other venues. And then, of course, if you really want to dive into the Chronicles themselves and learn a lot more detail about the stories and some of the historical facts behind the stories, I do have a website that is secondSonChronicles.com where you can dive really deep on the Chronicles even before you get into reading them.
Wow, that is excellent. I had the pleasure of going to your website, but I didn't realize how many other places that I could find you. So you now know all of the places that you can go and you can learn about the Chronicles and about the times that they're written and about upcoming things. So I hope you will check out uh, Second Son Chronicles. And it's important to start with the first book, or is each book standalone?
Each book is standalone, intentionally so, because you never know when someone's going to be in a library or a bookstore or browsing Amazon and they just pick up something. But I have heard from a number of readers that they really enjoyed starting with the first book and getting to know Alfred and getting to know his extended environment, his friends, his family, his colleagues, and that they have thoroughly enjoyed starting at the beginning. So
So
that would
there
be
you
my
go.
recommendation.
Yes. So there you go, audience. You can start from the beginning and you can become a follower and a fan and talk about the books with other followers and fans. And I hope that you will find out more and let us know. Let us know what you think. We'd love to know. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time for What Are You Reading? What Are You Writing?